Now I'd like to invite our panellists up for the first session. So I'd like to welcome the facilitator, Sally Thompson, who's the Deputy Director of Sector Engagement and Capability Development from the Future Social Service Institute in RMIT. And Sally is also a former ALA CEO, so you might notice a bit of a theme running through today. I'd also like to invite our panellists up, please. John Falzon, the CEO from St Vincent de Paul, Edwina McDonald, Co-Director from Policy ACOS, who very kindly stepped in for CEO Cassandra Goldie at the last minute, David Crosby, CEO of Community Council for Australia, and Gwyl Croucher, who's the Senior Lecturer at Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education, replacing Peter Noonan, and Michael Taylor from the National Policy, who's the National Policy Manager for Australian Industry Group. So if you haven't got a bio, the list of bios, there are a few spare around at the desk. I'd also just like to mention that we are videotaping this and we are taking photos, so if you've got any issues with that, could you please come up to me or someone at the registration desk to let us know. Now, the aim of the panel session is to provide an opportunity for panellists to put forward their perspective based on the proposed discussion points, which you will have seen in your program, to encourage panellists' interaction and comments, and to provide an opportunity for you as the audience to ask questions at the end. So our very talented facilitator, Sally Thompson, will help weave us through this dialogue and discussion. So I'll hand it over to Sally. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'm off to a good start. I'm taking seats of the panellists and looking after myself. So, look, I'd like to open this panel, first of all, by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank Elder Ron Jones for his really warm welcome, and through him pass on my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. I go to a lot of these events, and there's often a welcome to country, and whenever it's Elder Ron Jones, I always think, oh, beauty, because two things happen. One, I always learn something really interesting, and the other thing is that I always feel really deeply welcomed when Elder Ron Jones speaks. So, thank you to him. This panel is really where the rubber hits the road. We've been given some really big challenges in the two opening sessions by Sandy and by Tony, and this panel is really about getting to the tin tacks of what a lifelong learning policy might be, what the essential features of it might be, what are the obstacles to successful implementation of a lifelong learning policy, and what we think are the most powerful messages about the benefits of lifelong learning that we might put to government. So we've got some people here who have got some really strong experience of talking to government, sometimes with messages that government maybe might not want to hear. So I think we're really blessed to have them all. So we might start maybe at the end of the table. Are you happy to kick us off, Michael? So we might just run through the panellists with about 5 minutes each of their responses to the three key questions, and then we'll draw some threads together and then hand over to you, hopefully, to have some additional questions.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Well, of course, the focus of the Australian Industry Group is on workplaces, and so that's our particular interest in terms of overall lifelong learning. And of course, for workplaces, lifelong learning means access by workers to regularly update their skills. The skills, at least existing skills, need refreshing, some would say at least every 2 years. Plus there's a whole range of new skills that need to be acquired, and of course the emerging digital economy is putting a very sharp focus on that. In fact, I believe that's putting a bit of a focus on lifelong learning itself, the evolving needs of the economy. And I think this applies to all forms of learning, formal, informal, accredited and non-accredited. All of these are important in terms of skilling the existing workforce as a key plank, I believe, in what could become a lifelong learning policy. This also doesn't just apply to full qualifications. I think sub-qualification learning is important. Bite-sized, in the vet sector, bite-sized chunks of training, for example, is very, very important. The move to credentials, micro-credentials, is an interesting aspect in this regard. And of course we have had skill sets in the vet sector for some time, which are sub-qualifications. But of course this presupposes that this is available to existing workers, and that of course is not always the case. And underpinning the need for all of this lifelong learning in workplaces is of course a focus on literacy and numeracy. There's no lifelong learning policy, there's no literacy and numeracy policy either, or strategies. And it's hard to see how, in fact, we can get very far with a lifelong learning policy without having a renewed focus on literacy and numeracy in Australia. And we mustn't forget that, you know, workplaces are communities too, and that workplaces are, in fact, certainly can be centres of learning. Just quickly, I see a few. I'm not sure what the driver for lifelong learning is, notwithstanding ALA bringing this gathering together today. There are many sectors and many levels of government. It will be difficult to coordinate this kind of activity. Cost is also clearly an obstacle. And increasingly you need quality guidance for young people, well, all people really, in terms of what kind of learning they will undertake. And from our perspective, there don't seem to be any galvanising programs either that could be a feature of a lifelong learning policy. And the powerful message to government really is about, in our experience, productivity. If you can link lifelong learning to productivity, the government will listen. Otherwise, it's just a warm inner glow, and that doesn't really cut it, I don't think, in terms of the Australian government anyway. All right, I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. John Falzone, thank you. You're allowed to clap. John Falzone.
Thanks, Sally. I too would like to acknowledge that we're reflecting on the culture of learning on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm going to take a slightly different, less practical tack and actually suggest that learning is between ourselves, of course, and I prefer if it doesn't go outside this room. Learning is incredibly dangerous to the status quo. There's nothing neutral about learning. There's a beautiful quote from Vivienne Forrester, the French writer, the author of the beautiful little book called The Economic Horror. And she says, "There is nothing more subversive than thinking. To think is political." Now, by politics, I mean the distribution and the concentration of power, and particularly the battle between those two tendencies. And central to this is, of course, the revolutionary feminist insight that the personal is political. Learning means that, for example, those experiencing exclusion learn from those experiencing exploitation. The excluded learn from the exploited can learn from the excluded rather than have the wedge driven between them, and those who are neither can learn from both. Learning, critical thinking means analysing one's own experience of oppression, but more importantly, taking one outside your own experience and seeing the connectedness of your experience with other experiences of oppression, because there's nothing more that the forces controlling the status quo, patriarchy and capitalism, there's nothing more that they want than to make people feel atomised in their experience of exclusion and exploitation. Whether you're a migrant worker experiencing hyper-exploitation in the labour market, or a woman experiencing gendered violence There is nothing more perfect to maintain that oppression than to make the person feel that their experience is theirs alone and there is no connection with anyone else. It means that lightning flash of revelation that your struggle is my struggle and that you can't care about inequality here whilst ignoring it there. And that's why it is inherently dangerous, for it means taking a side instead of being taken by a side. There are some who say that we live in a market economy, not a market society. I would like to suggest, sadly, that a market society is in fact a corollary of a market economy. And therefore it's no surprise, it's no accident that education and learning has been increasingly commodified, packaged as a commodity to be profited from by predatory providers, packaged as a ticket for personal preferment and privilege. We know, of course, that learning is an incredibly powerful pathway out of poverty and disadvantage. Witness the many inspiring stories from TAFE, which should be regarded as a national treasure instead of being undermined and ripped asunder. For myself, I don't have a HECS debt, but I have a lifelong debt of gratitude to Blacktown Library. I praise the librarians of the world. Public libraries are the last and most powerful bastion of municipal socialism and should remain so. But education, because of its increased commodification, also becomes a powerful marker of inequality, which is why we should see learning as a weapon in that struggle against structural and historical inequality. And to remember that that struggle against inequality and for liberation, that struggle is our greatest teacher. There's no greater teacher than that struggle.
Thank you. Gwillem, yes. Is that working?
I think this is on.
Oh, you might have to do it. Oh, yeah, it just takes a little while for the light to come on. Try it now.
Okay, thanks. I don't think I can quite answer some of the broader questions of struggle you just raised there, but I did want to talk about one particular aspect when you're thinking about predatory providers and also thinking about the role that TAFE, higher education providers, universities have in a lifelong learning policy, and perhaps what are some of the broader structural issues at a national and state level that we can think about addressing, which helps us get towards being able to deliver sort of a national lifelong learning policy. Key, I would argue, especially looking at, and you brought up the predatory vet providers, and we know that there's been a long history of vet in this country getting a raw deal often, and some of that has been through federal government policies, some of it's been inadvertent, and there's a fair bit of policy complexity in terms of and I'm primarily talking here about the funding architecture. It's just historical anomaly going back to sort of the Martin Committee and decisions, Kang and others about how we're going to set up the system. So what I would advocate, and this is some work that me and Peter Noonan have done, is looking at a way to address what we would argue is probably a key fulcrum in terms of getting most of post-secondary education on a better track in terms of the funding. And that is to start to think seriously about a new COAG agreement, but also another conversation about the role of the states and the Commonwealth in terms of providing funding to all post-secondary education. Now, this, going back to the days of CTEC and NBEAT, following that, there's a long history in this country and in other countries of having, centrally coordinating bodies, and I know that many people in this room will have had long experience with them over the years. Given where we ended up with the mess with the vet fee help loans, right, as the latest example of what predatory providers can do, would argue very strongly that it is time to seriously look at having some sort of national body. And this would be a way to think about how we would incorporate a lifelong learning strategy for the nation. This would have to be part of the conversation. But once you've got this funding architecture that preferences a national view with different roles, you can start to incorporate a broader lifelong learning policy. It's a small part, but it's an important part about thinking about the role of TAFE and other vet providers, and ensuring that they are able to receive public subsidy, and where necessary, the part of the conversation is going to be about student contributions in a way that means that states are funding them adequately, and that the Commonwealth contribution to vet training is also part of the picture, but that we're not preferencing, and I guess this is the key point I wanted to end my brief comments on, we're not preferencing higher education institutions. Higher education institutions, in particular universities, they very much have a role to play, I would argue, in adult, in community education. It's a role that they've historically had going back a long way. It's ebbed and flowed at times, and I think there's a strong argument that people would make that, at present it's not as strong as it could be. Part of redressing this is to think about a national funding architecture, but also a national body that's able to help look at all the policy problems with regard to delivery and funding, also regulation, but also articulating that narrative. And I think that's the other key thing. It's about articulating that national narrative. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but it's sort of part of the, I think, underlying any sort of lifelong learning strategy.
Yep, fantastic, thank you, Paul. Edwina.
Great, thanks, Sally. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're on Aboriginal country, and I'll pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri Nation. It's really great to be part of this conversation, although a little bit nerve-wracking addressing a room full of educators. I'm conscious that all of you are very good at doing this yourself. And I think Tony mentioned that this is the year of lifelong learning, but where's its profile and how do we get people talking about it? And I think in doing this, this is a really great step towards that. And certainly for us at ACOS, it's been a really good process for us to be involved in turning our minds to this. As the Australian Council of Social Service, we focus on reducing poverty and inequality in Australia. And we haven't, spent a lot of time focusing on the lifelong learning space. And so it's a newer area for us. We're obviously ALA members of ours, and we've had an ongoing relationship with them through that and work with them on a range of issues, but it's not an area that we've really focused on in a lot of depth. So it was really interesting to do some reading around it, and I found a UK report around the benefits of lifelong learning for reduction of poverty. And it's really clear from the reading that I've done and from hearing Tony and Sandy speak this morning that lifelong learning has a really important contribution to reducing poverty and inequality in Australia. At ACOS, our most immediate priority to reduce poverty, which is currently affecting about 3 million people in Australia are below the poverty line. So at the moment, our most immediate priority has been around raising the rate of unemployment benefits. But we acknowledge in saying that to address the complex problem of poverty, we need a whole range of measures, and that includes housing, it includes health, and it includes education. So lifelong learning is a really important part of that. And it's really clear that lifelong learning leads to improved employment outcomes and increased income, and not just for gaining employment, but for sustaining meaningful employment as well. And also that it contributes to well-being, that enhances health literacy, financial literacy, community participation in our democracy as well. And so I guess going to the question of what are the essential features that we'd like to see in a lifelong learning policy, absolutely essential would be a focus on reducing poverty and disadvantage. I think we heard from Sandy around the focus of what lifelong learning can do for marginalisation and disadvantage. And similarly, equitable access would have to be a really important feature. and again, Sandy talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and no one left behind. So part of equitable access is also what's the government's responsibility, as Sandy said, in ensuring that as well. The other sort of really interesting reflection for me, which is built on by Tony's address this morning, was just the interaction between lifelong learning and that frame and some of the key areas that we do focus on at ACOS. And for us, one of the areas that we're currently very focused on is employment services. So in Australia at the moment, people living in poverty are forced into all kinds of education and training programs in order to get their unemployment payments of just $278 a week. And just looking at it, it's clear that this is far from a lifelong learning approach. It's not focused on people's wellbeing, and instead the mutual obligation system is largely a negative experience for many people who are on it. And I guess our sense, and employment services are currently being reviewed, is that they should be there fundamentally to help people into secure and sustainable work. But at the moment, the current system is not doing that, and it certainly fails the lifelong learning test. It's a really rigid system. We've got employment service providers needing to approve a training program. It has to be less than 12 months in duration. If they don't think it will lead to a job, it won't be approved. If a person turns down a job in order to continue the course, they're going to be facing being cut off from their income. So it's not a system that's focused on sustained and meaningful learning and employment. So the examples that we're seeing are things like migrants who've identified that the biggest barrier for them in accessing employment is language, but being told that they can't attend their English language class because there's been an interview found for them at a job that they may or may not want, and that regardless of whether they're doing a training course that will enhance their employability, they have to go to the interview and miss the course. We heard just last week in Tasmania a woman who was trying to do an MBA and being told that wasn't something that would work with her New Start arrangements. And certainly a big area is the community development programs that we're seeing in Aboriginal communities, and we've heard already about the importance of place-based approach and acknowledging local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And certainly that's not what we're seeing through the community development programs. And we're seeing people being forced to do training for things that they don't want to do, but also have no prospect of employment in their area. That's just training for training's sake. I think one example was a digital media training in a remote area where internet access was limited. And so it was people are just dropping out of these courses. And so in that area, we're supporting the 8-point model, which is a model that's community-led and community-driven model that would enhance employment participation. And I think what we can see is that the current system just sees any job as being good for the person, but what we know is that's not the case, and it's not good, especially for a person's wellbeing. And we've also got a government that's not valuing education, it's seeing education as a luxury. So at the moment, one of the bills before Parliament is cutting the pensioner education supplement, which supports single parents to access education, and has been largely successful. So when I look at this, I see we've got a system that's really focused on the individual as an economic agent rather than as a curious human being, and I think that would be really one of the obstacles in getting the successful lifelong learning policy up with government. But one of the opportunities is the way in which it can be used as a frame for other policy areas, and I think that builds on Tony's idea both of the importance of building the strategic alliances, that there are many areas where lifelong learning provides a really important framework for policy approaches, and that's why I really like that mortar idea, that it provides a mortar for the bricks, I guess, not just of university education, but other areas of policy where lifelong learning weaves in and out of in terms of addressing poverty and disadvantage. I think that's probably my 5 minutes.
Thanks, Edwina. Fantastic. David.
Good morning, everyone, and I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. I'm not actually getting my messages, although nowadays I wouldn't be surprised. I've actually got a quote, and I wanted to start with this quote because I find it really interesting. One of the great blots on our modern living is the cult of false values, a repeated application of the test of money, notoriety, applause. A world in which a comedian or a beautiful half-wit on the screen can be paid fabulous sums, while scientific researchers and discoverers can suffer neglect and starvation. It's a world that needs to have its sense of values violently set right. Does anyone know who said that? That was, it was said 75 years ago, and that was Robert Menzies in the Forgotten People speech. You know, the one that the Conservatives are always talking about as being, you know, the setting the agenda for liberalism in this country. Robert Menzies, like many great leaders, was a really strong believer in education, not for its economic value. I wrote an article last year about the commodification of charity, how charities have to turn everything they do into a product and a service and sell it, rather than the notion of connecting people and belonging and helping being part of what we do. And there's no doubt that education has been commodified. But for me, the issue becomes, what do we value? What's important in our society? And while we can talk about the systems and the structures and how things work, for as long as education is not valued, we will not have lifelong learning. You can change all the structures you want, reverse the funding models, create an independent authority, get rid of an independent authority. It won't mean one little bit of difference if the people we end up talking to are the people in the room. Because we're really preaching to the converted, the people that believe in education and understand the value of education and its role, and are prepared to do something about that, remains an incredibly small part of our community. You know, last weekend I was going off to see a local classical composer play a piece, and there were only about 50 people in the room. And on the way, you drive past sports fields that are full of cars of people, and you know, sport's great, and I played a lot of sport and I enjoy sport, but you've got to think, where are our values when the kinds of things that even Menzies was talking about 75 years ago, the development of the individual and the realisation of potential, not for its pecuniary value, is at the heart of the kind of country we live in. So what we've done at the Community Council for Australia, and ALA are members of the Community Council for Australia, in part, I mean, a lot of our work in representing charities is trying to change and block legislation that would impede the capacity of charities to do their work. But part of what we did a couple of years ago was bring together about 60 leaders in the sector and say, what kind of Australia do we want to live in? And what would the values of that Australia be? And we came up with 14 values. It's not hard to come up with values, you know, the fair, just, equitable. And then we looked at what the measures of those were, like fairness was distribution of income, justice was incarceration rates, safe was how safe women feel walking alone at night. And all of these are validated measures. The one that emerged as really critical was creative and education. And the values around that for us have been about even completing Year 12 as a measure, as a marker. There are lots of different markers. But when we bring people together, and we did, we brought a whole lot of educators and unions and principals and others together to talk about what we could do in that space as charities, it's really difficult to actually get an agenda that people agree to. Even the article by Lisa O'Brien from the Smith family a week ago in the Australian calling for a unique student identifier so we could actually see what happens to people is difficult. It's hard to get agreement amongst the broad church of education about what we should do. For me, what we've arrived at is that we need to engage our community in education. So we actually need to start getting everybody to start asking people what they learnt today. We need to make asking kids what they learnt today, asking our partners and our parents and our friends what we learnt today as part of a sort of national campaign. Because I actually believe we've got to be really focused on engaging broader than the education sector in advocating for education. It's seen as self-serving. It tends to be this kind of reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, you know, or rats fighting over the crumbs under the table. It's positioning, it's lobbying, it's vested interest, it's all those things. I think as a community, we need to drive not only parental engagement, but community engagement in education. And until we do that, we won't have lifelong learning.
Fantastic. Well, we've had 5 fantastic aspects on the question here. I'm just going to try and pull some of the threads together of to maybe start the questions going. So, Michael, you started by talking about the lack of a galvanising idea that would form the basis of a lifelong a galvanising program. That might actually sit across a lifelong learning policy, which kind of draws on Tony's idea of like a mortar. Like, what is the mortar? What's the galvanising program? So I'm going to pretend that I'm the Prime Minister and I've implemented Gwil's idea of a new COAG agreement, and I don't think there would be anyone, I could be wrong when we open up for discussion, who would disagree that we need some kind of agreement around governments to try and make this stuff work. But I'm also going to take up Sandy's comment earlier that really for a policy to work, it actually has to start with the most disadvantaged and then move upwards. And that's obviously something that's going to benefit everyone. So if I can put the question to the panellists, maybe those who are particularly working with the most disadvantaged, if we had a lifelong policy that started from the most disadvantaged in our community and worked up, and if there was agreement around that, what would that look like? Do you want to maybe start, John, and then maybe Edwina and David jump in?
I think the first thing I would posit as absolutely crucial to that kind of architecture would be that the actual design was informed by the experience of the people experiencing disadvantage. So something, the very nature of learning is participatory. It's absolutely viscerally democratic, or should be. And so it should fly in the face as a countercultural prophetic movement, completely different to the kind of neo-paternalistic, top-down, absolutely disempowering projects that we have seen recently, notably exemplified by the Northern Territory intervention and its various iterations that were trialled first on the First Nations peoples and then by extension and the logic of internal colonisation imposed elsewhere. And so what you are describing to me should, of its very essence, come from below rather than be imposed even by people with the best intentions from above.
Absolutely, John. So much more eloquently than I could have put it, but I think it absolutely needs to be a local, community-based, community-owned, community-driven model, and not a cookie-cutter approach, which is, I guess, particularly in the job services model that I was talking about, is very much the cookie-cutter approach. And it needs to be, something that people own, people identify what it is that they want to learn and how they want to learn it. That would absolutely have to be the most essential starting place for it.
For me, Sally, I commenced my second career in Doveton, where I set up a school for truants. I already had worked in Pentridge and Tirana as a special ed teacher and taught for many years in the tech system. And what I find really frustrating is the sense of Project Epitarsis littered throughout education. Here lies the We Did Good program, and it made a difference for a while, it existed for a while, and then it's gone. And it's gone because David moved on, or someone moved on, or something else happened, or the funding was stopped, or the school principals that were supporting it, And for me, there's a problem here that we don't build on what works. And the question is, why don't we build on what works? There are brilliant models of education. I think Australia has some of the most innovative and effective educational programs working with marginalised people anywhere. But we don't build on them, we don't replicate them. And why don't we? It's because they're not valued. It's that simple. And because they're not valued, they're vulnerable. So some of the programs that people in this room run are vulnerable. And they're vulnerable because they're not valued. And so for me, the real issue is about creating value about those programs that are already working in that space and doing fantastic work. And you know, I could mention 2 or 3, but I'm sure people in the room know more than I do, where people have worked within communities and managed to much more effectively engage whole communities in education. But those programs probably won't exist in 5 years' time.
Just before we go over to questions, I just want to wrap one other thread together. So there was another sort of conversation going on about the different silos and the need for people to have dialogue beyond their neck of the woods. And I think, Will, you made the point of how complex just in the higher ed vet space it is, and how much work there has to be done to bring alignment and cohesion into that space. Before it then expands to other people. And also want to pick up your point too, Michael, around literacy and numeracy, that literacy and numeracy doesn't seem to be part of the conversation at all. So I'm just wondering if, Michael or Will, whether you had any thoughts, and both of you, about how we can expand the conversation, because I would suggest that people like yourself, Will, are often at the table, and you too, Michael, when it comes to conversations about education and training. But I think we've heard a really strong message that it has to actually go beyond just industry, it has to go beyond just higher ed, it actually has to bring in a broader range of people and really listen to some grassroots voices coming up. So any thoughts about dialogue and engagement across sectors?
Yeah, and I think that's an extremely good point about the disjunction you often get between, you know, bottom-up valuing and how things are implemented with, you know, top-down. There is a real risk, in my view, of leaving things to governments, be they state or Commonwealth. Unfortunately, governments are the ones that collect the money, and they're often the ones that distribute the money. So part of the trick, I would suggest, you know, once you can, you know, build community narrative support decisions, and it is bottom-up, is thinking a bit about institutional structures that can ensure that that doesn't get trampled by, you know, the brutal 3-4 year electoral calculus that tends to drive governments, you know, rightly or wrongly. Some of us would argue wrongly, but that is the reality I think a lot of us, you know, experience on a day-to-day basis, is that part of the reason that these programs are not continued is nothing to do with the programs. You know, maybe that's an element, but it's often, you know, to do with the changing whims of politicians. So I guess the point I just make is that thinking about that kind of institutional infrastructure, be that bodies that are representative and rightly representative and structured in ways with proper governance that means that they will continue to be representative, that can help link governments, industry, others, I think is an important part of this picture.
That's good. Michael, reflections?
You know, I guess our experiences in the workplace literacy and numeracy arena, I mean, according to you'll probably know this, international studies indicate that there are 4 million workers in Australia currently below the minimum required standard to operate effectively in the workplace and society. 4 million. And there's no program. There was a program, but it was abolished in the Abbott government in 2014. So for, 4 years now, we've had nothing at all. And of course the need's still there. So, and we constantly talk to the national government about this, and we constantly advocate for a program, and a jointly funded program funded by government and by employers. So far without any success. But to me, that's the sort of thing that you need as a key plank in a lifelong learning policy. And a program, which we'd be happy to be involved in helping design, does galvanise people together to achieve lifelong learning around a particular focus. So that's the sort of thing that I had in mind.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. I might open it up to questions from the floor, and I'm counting on Jenny to give us the sad face baby picture when we're running close to over time. Yes. Now we've got a microphone coming, I believe.
Hi, my name's Karen Dimke, and I work from a whole range of different places, the Vet Development Centre, La Trobe, TAFE, Learn Locals, because I work as a teacher educator. And lots of familiar faces in the room, which is lovely to see. But I'm really passionate about supporting people who are the teachers or the trainers in this sector. And because we're working with some of the hardest people to help, some of the most disadvantaged learners, so we actually need the best educators, because we're looking at trauma, we're looking at learning disabilities, often a whole range of issues. And but currently, people who teach or train in this sector are some of the lowest paid. And I appreciate David's point of view that it's an indication too of the lack of value that is given to educators in this space. And very often educators who are working in this space, they go from a very intuitive space, like, but I want to see a more intentional approach. So rather than going from chance to design in the way we teach these learners, because it's all very well to set up these learning opportunities, but we need the best educators in that space. And so I'm wondering, my question is, where do you see sitting within the policy that we can also acknowledge the educators in this space and the fact that they need to be recognised, valued and appropriately supported with relevant training?
Do you want to grab that one, Will?
Yeah. There's a couple of things I might say to this in terms of the policy space particularly. I don't think you can get away from the point been made by a number of people on the panel, including David and yourself, that the broader issue of how we value teachers at all different levels and types of education that we do is really the key. The key underpinning part of the issue here. The largest employer of secondary school teachers, as we know, is state governments. And that ultimately comes down to voters in the states. University and often higher education teachers are reasonably well paid comparatively, so we don't need to worry about them. We need to think about who's advocating for those in other sectors, and other sorts of teachers. In terms of the broader policy problem, it really gets back to that issue of what is the narrative here, and this is where I would argue, and maybe others would agree or disagree, but that's where we need a broad national conversation, and that's one thing to argue against what I argued before, that institutions aren't going to help, and that's about a national conversation. It also gets back to other related issues to do with how we value knowledge, science, research on one end, and also a broader suite of social issues.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that? Yeah.
Just a couple of points, and I think one is building on David's point about how we value education, and also, and I think part of the challenge is in ensuring that the education is valued, and then that places more value on the educator. But my background personally in delivering community education is in the community legal sector, and in the community legal sector, community education is seen as one of the really key pillars of delivering community legal services, along with advice and legal advocacy, and also political advocacy, changing the system, law reform. And so they're seen as really three key pillars in the community legal sector. Also, community development is often added as a fourth. And with the legal education, there's been a lot of work into the value of education and what that means for outcomes for clients, and the fact that it's really essential. If you want somebody to access their legal rights, they need to know, first of all, that they exist. If they don't know they exist, they're not going to access them. One of those bits of research that you think, really, someone had to go do a PhD on this? Yes. But it's been, and the result has been that in particular, the community education part of, I think, that sector has become more stable and more recognised as a key part of delivery, and it sort of came out of a community legal centre movement, is now more mainstream in legal aid, government legal aid, and I think what we're seeing now, and certainly David's very involved in this, as are we, is the continuing attack on the advocacy in the law reform and trying to establish that part needs to be valued. So I think part of it is that continual fight to see that this is actually really important in all kinds of industries, as a key part of achieving rights. But then I think the other part, as you said, is the undervaluing of the educators. And I'm sort of sitting here on this panel of mainly men, looking at a room of mainly women. And I don't know about the statistics in the ACE sector, but I'm assuming it's a very female-dominated sector. So I think this largely feeds into a larger debate around gender equality in the workforce, gender pay equity. We're looking at, it's education. It kind of fits into the care domain, particularly when we're talking about education that's not university or it's not school. When we're talking about it, there's more. It's really part of that larger debate, and I think it needs to be seen in that. And it's really important that, developing a lifelong learning policy is one thing, but it sits within a larger frame, which both is around the value of community services, the value of the work that we do, but also the gender pay equity question.
Thanks. John?
Just to say, we need to be, apropos your comments earlier, Gwyl, about academics and teachers in the TAFE system and the higher education system being relatively well looked after. I think we know that we're looking at two areas of incredibly high casualisation and insecurity, and therefore, we know that it's an industrial issue, a profoundly industrial issue, and really resonates profoundly with the ACTU's current campaign around people's rights at work and the changing nature of the labour market and how we need to combat that. So, you're absolutely right. We need to look at the valorisation of teachers, the way we pay them, but also the conditions, the insecurity, and the incredible exploitation of people in academia and in higher education.
Just want to check on the time before I take another question. Have I got time for another question? Catherine, Jenny's time for one more question? Yep, okay. So Dave, here, yep. And then have we got time for two more questions or just... Yeah, okay, so Dave here and then question at the back. Yeah.
There's too many questions to ask, but I'll try and make a comment and then, again, like Karen, ask a question. I was privileged to talk last year at the Australians Correction Education Association conference, so taking up one of Tony's Wodonga group, the people who are incarcerated in Australia, and our increasing population being incarcerated. I was sandwiched between a corrections education person from America and somebody from Norway. I was doing my normal thumping of the table about the importance of literacy and numeracy skills. But the American person was talking about the fact that they were incarcerating more and more people and the statistics were diabolical. But then we were followed by a person who headed up corrections education in Norway, where the whole attitude was completely the opposite. That is, the prison population was declining. In Victoria, whenever the government proposes we build another prison, every community complains and nobody wants it in their backyard. They cannot close prisons in Norway because the community want the prisons in their community so that they are involved as part of it. They see that as their responsibility, and that they see it's important that in fact they work with people who have been put into some sort of form of sentencing, that it's their responsibility to look after the local people. So they complain, even when the prisons are the most horrific and the government wants to close them because the conditions are really bad, the community will not allow them to close those prisons. So my question is, it seems to me that in whatever policy we talk about, whatever programs we talk about, it's almost the elephant in the room. How do we change social and cultural perspectives so that our community believes in lifelong education, no matter who the group is we're trying to target? So to me, it's how do we incorporate? This won't happen unless we change the social and cultural perspective on the value of education and how we support all of the groups that Tony were talking about. So I haven't got an answer, so I'll let you guys
Good question.
answer
Very
the
aligned
question.
with David's question. But what I might do, given that we're sort of in the home stretch, I might actually take all three questions and then ask the panel to respond to any or all of them. So up the back here, and then the woman next to you also has a question.
Hi everyone, I'll stand up since I'm in the back row. My name's Jill Finch, I'm from the National Reading and Writing Hotline. We're the folk who take all the calls from individuals and communities and employers around Australia when they're looking for literacy and numeracy classes. There are so many questions, I agree with Dave. I guess my primary question is how we see a national adult literacy and numeracy policy sitting within a national lifelong learning policy. We see on a daily basis, or we hear on a daily basis, the disparity between theory and reality in all of these paternalistic programs like the AMEP program, the C program, the CDP, Community Development Program, and the much lamented long-lost WELL program. How do we pull all these things together and get national literacy policies happening? I'm excited to be here because we're trying to get a conversation started about having a national literacy policy as well. So I guess the question is, how does that sit within or alongside or as part of the bigger lifelong learning policy?
Great
Thanks.
question, Jill. Thank you. And the woman next to you had a question as well. We might take the three.
Hi, my name is Natasha Van Cleef. I'm actually here with the Learning City Committee in Wyndham. But I've also been
a little bit. There we go.
sorry, I've
Great.
also been part of the AMEP program, coordinated that, and then worked in secondary and also university education. So this is all speaking to me a lot. We've talked about some really huge social and cultural change that's needed, a sense of social responsibility, democratic learning, value of education, paternalism. The someone should culture, which is what I call it. Someone should do, but it's never us. And the also choosing education because of economic reasons. Those are a lot of things that take a lot of cultural shift. And I'm wondering, in my columns of notes, implementation is quite bare. And I was wondering how we would implement those social shifts.
Great, fantastic. Okay, there are three quite different questions, and given that it is our last question, we might actually just go right along the panel. But I might start with you, David, if that's okay.
Sure. I'm not a big fan of policies. Australia has a fantastic reputation for producing policies that are really sets of words that everyone can agree to that float across the sky like nebulous clouds with don't even cast a shadow. I've been CEO of the Alcohol and Other Drugs Council of Australia for 7 years, CEO of the Mental Health Council of Australia for 5 years. We've had national drugs policies, national alcohol policies, national mental health policies. They're not worth the paper they're written on. They're really just getting people in a room to all say, yes, we agree, that's what we're trying to achieve. The question is, what are you going to do? And I think you're right to focus on implementation. Because the rest just, as Jonathan Saul said, words without utility are just decoration. And there's a lot of decoration around education. And you asked me what you should do. Seeing it's, I don't know whether to tell, have I got time to tell a little story?
If it's a super...
yes or no?
Oh, Jenny's saying no. I'm
Okay.
saying if it's a quick
Well,
story, because I love a good story.
I won't tell a story then, but... yeah, all right, I'll tell
You have to tell the story now.
I was teaching at Williamstown Tech, and I'd set up a program for kids who'd been expelled from schools in the western suburbs, 15-year-olds. I had a qualification in special emotional disturbance and social disadvantage. So I had 15 of these 15-year-old pains in the arse, really, really problematic kids. One of them, and I was looking around for literature about how to work with these kids, and there's bugger all literature about what to do. There's lots of classifications of the problems and all that, but there's bugger all about what you actually do with these kids. And then I read a book by Art Pearl called The Positive Value of Youth. And it was actually about what you could do positively with these kids, and I thought, fantastic. And I wrote Art Pearl a letter saying, thanks for the book, it's the first one I've read. He wrote back saying, I'm coming to Australia, I want to come and watch you teach. So the big American education professor was coming out to Williamstown Tech. So it became a really big deal. The regional director came down, there was morning tea and all this stuff. And of course I practiced my lesson with these kids. And so I started this lesson, I won't tell the whole story, but I started this lesson and this little kid who'd just been released from Tirana, this is in the 80s when any kid that was at risk was locked up for 3 weeks while they were assessed. It was a kind of bizarre system. And he'd been assessed and released back to his mum, so he'd come running back to school. And he came into my class and he was being a pain in the arse. And so we decided to trial him and to have a trial. And I don't know whether you've worked with most people in the room have worked with disadvantaged kids quite a lot. They're not very good with language, but they're fantastic at this kind of reading situations, much better than I am. So this kid set up the children's court exactly right, and we did a role play. And, we had the court reporters and the police and the people from Tirana and the police and, it was really done well. And I thought, what a brilliant education experience. How good am I? I've turned adversity into a fantastic teaching experience. I'm the greatest teacher ever. So I sit down, because Art Pearl says, can I have him for 5 minutes? And he stands up in front of these kids and he says, what'd you learn today? And the kids said nothing, we just mucked around with David. That's why we like coming to school, because we get to muck around with David and not have to do any real work. So then Art said, okay, and then off the kids went. They didn't actually go off, I stood off and told them off, but then off they went. I told them they had learned things. I actually told them that if I'd handed out a book about the children's court and made them read 5 chapters and answer 20 questions at the end of each chapter, would they have learned something? They said yes. Did you learn something by actually being in the children's court today? No. We just mucked around. So Art Pearl's walking me back down for the lunchtime reception, and he's a big American guy. He's got his hand over my shoulder. Because I was really upset. And he said, what are those kids doing now, David? I said, well, they're out in the playground creating problems. He said, yeah, but what are they saying to people? I said, what do you mean? What are they saying to the other kids? That they just muck around with David. What are they saying when other teachers come over? That they just muck around with David. What are they saying when they get home? That they just muck around with David. He said, you are doing some of the best work I've seen, and you are the most vulnerable program I have ever visited. So you asked me what you can do, create value. I went back, I documented those kids' lives, I documented a comparison group, I showed that what we were doing was effective, and I started to write. Not just to validate my experience, but to validate the kids' experience. And until we start that kind of campaigning and creating value, I think the rest risks just being decoration.
What a great story. Thanks, David. Quick reflections from the rest of the panel. We're not quite at the crying baby face, but we're getting close, so if we can keep the comments.
Well, I was just going, my point would just build on that, which is, I think, the question of how do you change the cultural stereotypes. That's a big question, right? And it's not just about education, it's about the people who, it's about prisoners. Are prisoners deserving of education, or are they just there for punishment? It's about people on unemployment benefits. Are we just forcing them back into the workforce because they're being lazy? These are all the stereotypes that exist that we need to shift, and it is a really... that's the challenging question. If we could do that, wow. But I think for me, the place to start is the storytelling. And David just showed us the great power of a good story. And I think really we've seen that in the marriage equality debate recently, that one of the really powerful things was the storytelling with the people that that people were really shifted by. I know someone, my friend, my daughter, my cousin, that there's real power in telling stories and drawing out people's empathy when they have that day-to-day experience. And so I think part of it is it's collecting the stories and having the evidence, and then it's telling the stories, and it's telling the stories to all the people you know, all the people you meet, your family, friends, and it's broadening that out into influencing more and more powerful people in creating the network. And then I think the challenge is how do you recreate that level of empathy and storytelling when it's not your brother, when it's not someone who's a family member. But I think there is a real power in storytelling, and if we can collect the data but have a storytelling approach to it, And some of the most successful changes I've had with ministers and government is about, it's not about the piles and piles of reports and data that provide the evidence. It's the one story that they just go, oh yes, I get that. I really get that now.
Great. Thanks, Edwina. Gwyn?
The one last point I just wanted to make, and it picks up partly from there in terms of, how do you communicate this and what's going to get the traction, is also to think in terms of the systems approach, which was the point that Sandra made at the end of her presentation. How all the bits fit together, I think, is extremely important. So, once you've got a narrative and once you've got support and once you've thought about all sorts of different areas, it's how to link that into, seamless implementation of programs that a number of people have pointed out becomes where the rubber really hits the road. And in some ways that does require a bit of a back engineering, I think. You've got to approach it from both ends at the same time. Think about where you want to end up, but also where you start.
Fantastic.
I'd just like to say that we're not having this discussion in some kind of policy limbo where we're just throwing around ideas and wondering, gee, that worked or that doesn't work. We're on a battlefield because there are forces that are actively trying to make things harder. I mean, when I hear that, you, Michael, talk about a literacy program that was shut down, something that was working, that was good, and government deliberately going out of its way to shut down things that work, to set up things that hurt, that are vicious. There's no other, they're not accidentally inflicting pain. They're deliberately vicious. They're deliberately putting the boot into people who are experiencing disadvantage and inequality. So we need to know what we are up against, to analyse those forces, to not lose heart, to feel like, well, the harder they fight us, the more they teach us about the terrain that we're operating on. But here's the key thing, not to let that program of deliberate humiliation frame what we do. We need to reframe. I think that's the most important thing is if we want to create a different set of values, if we want to create a space in which these things can work and that people can experience self-determination, we need to create the frame.
Thank you. Michael, final thoughts?
Well, I think we all know that the research tells us teachers make the single biggest difference. We know that. But it's expensive. That's the problem. And government tends to see learning through the prism of expense. They see it as a cost rather than an investment. That's what you're dealing. That's what you're working against. Not in all society. It's not like in Norway or Sweden, where there's a different cultural attitude to it. But here, currently anyway, that's what you have to deal with. And so, if you want to make a difference, you've got to demonstrate outcomes. You've got to demonstrate that this produces an outcome. That this investment of this money in this type of education will actually have a payoff, if you like. And I mean, for example, we all know the benefits for the individuals who participate in literacy and numeracy programs, but we ran a program where we demonstrated the benefit for employers, excuse me, who run the program, i.e. there was a return on investment. So listen, employers, here's another reason, there's lots of good reasons for doing literacy programs. Another reason is it actually pays. And so if you can have programs that demonstrate those kinds of social outcomes, I think you have a chance of government listening.
Thank you. What fantastic timing. I've just been given the stop now crying baby. Please, what a smart and insightful panel. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Please join me in thanking you. And what smart and insightful questions too. So please clap yourself.